I'm Commander Lisa Sanders, 38, and I climbed from a middle-class neighborhood in Ohio to the upper ranks of the U.S. Navy through sheer determination and sacrifice. For 2 years, I bent over backward trying to win over my boyfriend's wealthy family, rearranging my military schedule, spending months of salary on gifts, and swallowing insult after insult with a smile. But when his mother called me a deadbeat in front of a room full of people, dismissing my 15 years of service as not a real job, I made a decision that flipped everything upside down. Have you ever poured your heart into earning someone's approval, only to have them crush your dignity when you least expected it? If so, drop your story below. Trust me, you're not alone in this. Quick favor before we dive in, let me know what city you're watching from, and if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect, smash that like button. What happened after I walked out of that dinner party will blow your mind. Margaret never apologized or acknowledged her behavior, but I'd stopped expecting her to. Some people aren't capable of the self-reflection required for genuine change, and that was her limitation to bear, not mine to fix. The transition to San Diego marked more than just a change of duty station. It represented a return to the person I'd been before I started measuring my worth against impossible standards. The Pacific Fleet assignment was everything I'd hoped, demanding, prestigious, and perfectly aligned with my long-term career goals. My new position involved coordinating logistics for multinational naval exercises, work that required the kind of strategic thinking and diplomatic skill I'd developed over 15 years of service. The complexity was energizing rather than overwhelming, and I found myself working with renewed focus and enthusiasm. But perhaps more importantly, I was surrounded by colleagues who evaluated my performance based on competence rather than social acceptability. The relief of being judged by professional standards after months of navigating arbitrary personal criticism was profound. Lieutenant Martinez, who had been transferred to my command as part of a career development program, noticed the change immediately. "You seem different, ma'am," she said during one of our weekly mentoring sessions. "More confident, if that makes sense." "It makes perfect sense," I replied. I spent some time forgetting who I was professionally. It's good to remember. The work itself was a constant reminder of my capabilities. Coordinating exercises involving ships from 6 different navies required skills Margaret Whitfield had never valued: cultural sensitivity, logistical precision, and the ability to build consensus among strong-willed leaders from different backgrounds. When the first major exercise concluded successfully ahead of schedule and under budget, my commanding officer's commendation mentioned my exceptional leadership under complex circumstances. Reading those words, I remembered why I'd chosen this career and why Margaret's opinion of it had been irrelevant from the beginning. David visited twice during my first 6 months in San Diego, and our relationship continued to evolve in the direction of honest friendship rather than romantic partnership. The physical distance had clarified what we'd both suspected. We worked better as people who cared about each other than as people trying to build a life together. "You're happier," he observed during his second visit, as we walked along the harbor at sunset. "I can see it in how you move, how you talk about your work." "I'm myself again," I said. "That's different from happiness, but it's probably more important." He nodded, understanding the distinction. We'd both learned something valuable about the difference between love and compatibility, between caring for someone and being right for them. Our breakup, when it came, was mature and mutual. David needed to find someone who fit more naturally into his family's world, and I needed to be with someone who valued my professional life rather than seeing it as an obstacle to overcome. Captain Whitfield maintained occasional contact through professional channels, sending congratulations when news of my successful assignments reached Navy circles in Virginia. His messages were brief but genuine, and they helped maintain the connection to the one member of David's family who had consistently treated me with respect. Margaret's reaction to our breakup, according to David, was predictable relief mixed with criticism of my inability to prioritize relationships over career. Her response confirmed everything I'd come to understand about her character. She was incapable of seeing my professional success as anything other than a personal failing. But her opinion had lost the power to wound me. I'd rebuilt my sense of self on a foundation that couldn't be shaken by someone else's narrow worldview, and the work of reconstruction had made me stronger than I'd been before. My third year in San Diego brought unexpected recognition when I was selected for promotion to captain, a rank that put me among the top echelon of Navy leadership. The promotion came with assignment to the Pentagon, a position that would influence naval policy at the highest levels. The night I received confirmation of my promotion, I called my parents in Ohio to share the news. Their pride was uncomplicated and absolute, a reminder of what unconditional support actually looked like. I met David at Naval Station Norfolk during what should have been the worst month of my career. I'd just returned from an 8-month deployment in the Persian Gulf, exhausted and questioning whether the sacrifices were worth it. He was waiting tables at a diner off base, putting himself through law school, and something about his easy smile made me forget about the loneliness that had been eating at me for months. We talked until 3 a.m. that first night. He didn't flinch when I told him about the missed birthdays, the holidays spent on a ship thousands of miles from home, or the weight of commanding a crew of 200 sailors. Instead, he listened with the kind of attention I'd forgotten existed outside the military chain of command. 6 months later, when I made lieutenant commander, he was the first person I called. When he passed the bar exam, I used my leave time to fly back and celebrate with him. We understood each other's ambitions in a way that felt rare and precious. His family, however, occupied a different universe entirely. The Whitfields had roots in Virginia that traced back to before the Civil War, money that had been carefully preserved through generations, and expectations that seemed carved in stone. Their world revolved around country club memberships, charity galas, and a social hierarchy I'd never encountered growing up in a middle-class neighborhood in Ohio. The first time David took me to their estate in Richmond, I spent 2 hours getting ready. I'd bought a dress that cost more than my monthly car payment, practiced small talk in the mirror, and researched their philanthropic interests so I'd have something intelligent to contribute to conversations. Margaret Whitfield greeted me at the door wearing pearls that probably cost more than my annual salary and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "So you're the sailor David's been telling us about," she said, making sailor sound like a profession slightly more respectable than piracy. Her husband, retired Navy Captain James Whitfield, was different. He shook my hand with the firm grip of someone who understood military bearing, looked me directly in the eye, and said, "Lieutenant Commander Sanders, I've heard good things about your service." There was no performance in his respect, no calculation. It was the recognition of one officer acknowledging another. But Margaret set the tone for every subsequent family gathering. I learned to navigate their world carefully, showing up early to help with preparations, bringing expensive wine I'd researched thoroughly, and dressing in a way that might pass their scrutiny. I memorized the names of their friends, their children's accomplishments, their vacation destinations. I turned myself into someone I thought they might accept. During those early visits, I watched Margaret hold court at dinner parties, dispensing opinions about everything from local politics to the proper way to arrange flowers. Her friends nodded along, a chorus of agreement that never seemed to include me. When they asked about my work, their questions carried an undertone of polite bewilderment, as if they couldn't quite understand why anyone would choose such a life. "How fascinating that you travel so much for work," one of Margaret's friends said during a garden party, her tone suggesting travel for work was somehow different from the European vacations they took annually. Though it must be difficult to maintain any real relationships. I smiled and explained that military service required sacrifice, but offered rewards they might not understand. Margaret nodded along, but I could see her filing away my words for later critique. The pattern established itself quickly. At every gathering, Margaret would find subtle ways to highlight what she saw as my shortcomings. My dress was too plain or too bold, my conversation too serious or too casual, my schedule too demanding or too flexible. She never delivered direct insults, but her message came through clearly. I was a temporary inconvenience in their family story, someone who would eventually be replaced by a more suitable choice. Captain Whitfield remained consistently courteous, asking thoughtful questions about my deployments and sharing stories from his own Navy career. But he was often outnumbered by Margaret and her allies, a quiet voice of reasonableness in conversations that felt like carefully orchestrated examinations. I threw myself into winning them over with a determination that would have impressed my commanding officers. I rearranged my leave schedule to attend their anniversary party, spent a month's salary on a wedding gift for David's cousin, and volunteered to coordinate the logistics for their annual 4th of July celebration. Each gesture was met with polite acknowledgement that somehow felt more dismissive than outright rejection. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd led naval operations in international waters, managed complex logistics under pressure, and earned commendations for my leadership under fire. But sitting in Margaret Whitfield's living room, I felt like a teenager trying to pass an exam I'd never been properly prepared for. David saw the strain, but didn't fully understand it. "She's just old-fashioned," he'd say after particularly difficult visits. "She'll come around once she gets to know you better." But I was beginning to understand that Margaret didn't want to know me better. She'd already decided who I was and what I represented in her carefully ordered world. My rank, my service record, my dedication to something larger than myself, none of it translated into currency she valued. Still, I kept trying. I attended their church when I was in town, contributed to their political candidates, and smiled through conversations that felt like elaborate tests I was destined to fail. I told myself that love required compromise, that families were complicated, and that patience would eventually pay dividends. Captain Whitfield's quiet respect became my anchor during those visits. He never made a show of supporting me, but his acknowledgement felt genuine in a way that stood out sharply against the performative politeness that surrounded us. When Margaret's friends made cutting remarks about military life, he would redirect the conversation with the skill of someone accustomed to managing difficult personalities. I should have recognized the warning signs earlier, should have understood that Margaret's tolerance was strategic rather than genuine. But I was so focused on earning my place in their world that I missed the obvious truth. Some battles can't be won through determination alone. The foundation was already cracking, and I was too busy trying to fix the surface to notice. The shift started with small comments that I initially dismissed as generational differences. Margaret had a talent for delivering criticism wrapped in what sounded like concern or observation, making it difficult to address directly without seeming oversensitive. "You clean up well for a military girl," she told me at David's birthday dinner, her voice carrying just enough warmth to make the insult seem like a compliment. The other guests smiled politely, unsure how to respond, while I maintained my composure and thanked her. But the comments became more frequent and more pointed. At a charity luncheon where I'd volunteered to help coordinate the silent auction, Margaret introduced me to her friends by saying, "This is David's girlfriend. She's in the Navy, though maybe one day she'll have a real career." The words stung, but what hurt more was the casual way she delivered them, as if my 15 years of military service were equivalent to an extended gap year. I'd been running naval operations that kept shipping lanes secure, managing budgets larger than most small businesses, and leading teams through complex international missions. But in Margaret's world, none of that translated into respectability. Her friends began to echo her dismissive attitude. At family gatherings, they'd ask questions designed to highlight what they saw as the limitations of military life. "Don't you ever want to settle down and have a normal job?" one of them asked during a cocktail party, as if serving my country was an adolescent phase I'd eventually outgrow. I started noticing how Margaret positioned these conversations, always in front of audiences, always when David was across the room or occupied with other relatives. She seemed to understand that public humiliation carried more weight than private criticism, that forcing me to respond graciously to insults made her appear reasonable while casting me as either weak for accepting abuse or difficult for pushing back. The breaking point came during what should have been a celebration. David had just made partner at his law firm, and Margaret had organized a dinner party to mark the occasion. I'd arranged my schedule months in advance to be there, trading duty assignments with colleagues and cutting short a training exercise to make sure I could attend. I arrived straight from the airport, still in my dress uniform because I'd come directly from a change of command ceremony for a colleague. Margaret took one look at me and announced to the assembled group, "Here comes the deadbeat." "Still no real job, I hear." The room went quiet. I felt every eye turn toward me, measuring my reaction, waiting to see how I'd handle this public dismissal. Some of the guests looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. Margaret's smile remained perfectly in place, as if she'd just commented on the weather. I'd faced hostile interrogations, managed personnel crises, and maintained composure under pressure that most people couldn't imagine. But standing in that elegant dining room, wearing the uniform I'd earned through years of sacrifice and dedication, I felt something inside me crystallize into cold clarity. "Excuse me," I said quietly, setting down the bottle of wine I'd brought as a gift. I seemed to have made a mistake. I walked out without another word, leaving behind the dinner I'd rearranged my entire schedule to attend, the family I'd tried so hard to win over, and any illusion that patience and persistence would eventually earn Margaret's respect. David found me sitting in my rental car in their circular driveway 20 minutes later. Through the passenger window, I could see the warm light spilling from their dining room windows, the party continuing without me. "What happened?" he asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. I told him about his mother's greeting, about the months of accumulated insults, about the careful campaign of humiliation she'd been conducting. He listened without interrupting, his face growing tighter with each detail. "I'll go back in there and no," I said, starting the engine. "Don't confront her tonight. This isn't about defending my ego, David. It's about something bigger than that." He climbed into the passenger seat, and we drove back to my hotel in silence. I spent that night replaying not just Margaret's latest insult, but every interaction we'd had over the past 2 years. The pattern was unmistakable. She'd been testing my limits, seeing how much abuse I'd accept in the name of family harmony. I thought about the young sailors I'd mentored, the leadership principles I'd tried to model, the values I'd sworn to uphold. I'd taught countless personnel that respect isn't negotiable, that dignity isn't something you trade away for temporary peace. Yet I'd been violating those principles in my personal life, accepting treatment I'd never tolerate in a professional setting. The next morning, David called to tell me his father had been furious about Margaret's behavior, that there had been a confrontation after I left. Captain Whitfield had apparently told his wife that her conduct was disgraceful and that she owed me an apology. But I wasn't waiting for apologies anymore. I'd learned something valuable in that humiliating moment. Margaret's opinion of me said more about her character than mine. I'd been so focused on earning approval from someone whose values I didn't even share that I'd lost sight of my own worth. The real tragedy wasn't that Margaret Whitfield thought I was beneath her family. The tragedy was that I'd almost started to believe her. That night in the hotel room, I made a decision that felt like stepping back onto solid ground after months of trying to find my footing on shifting sand. I would stop chasing Margaret's approval, stop pretending we were family, and stop sacrificing my dignity for the sake of keeping peace. The change wasn't dramatic or announced with grand gestures. I simply began treating the Whitfield family invitations like any other social obligation, something to be evaluated based on my own priorities rather than automatically accepted out of duty. When Margaret called the following week to invite me to her book club's charity fundraiser, I declined politely. "I have training exercises that weekend," I told her, which was true. I'd specifically requested additional duty assignments to fill my schedule. "Oh," she said, and I could hear the surprise in her voice. "Well, perhaps next time." There wouldn't be a next time, at least not on the same terms. I'd spent 2 years rearranging my military commitments to accommodate their social calendar, trading valuable training opportunities and career advancement for the chance to sit through events where I was barely tolerated. That pattern was ending. David noticed the change immediately. "You seem different," he said during one of our phone conversations. I was between deployments, and he was visiting me at my base housing. "I feel different," I admitted. "More like myself." He didn't push for details, but I could see him processing the implications. Our relationship had been built partly on the assumption that I would continue bending myself into shapes that might eventually fit his family's expectations. Without that assumption, we both had to figure out what remained. The invitations kept coming for a few weeks, smaller gatherings, family dinners, casual get-togethers. I declined most of them, attending only the events that felt genuinely important to David rather than performances designed to win his mother's approval. Margaret's response was predictable. She began complaining to other family members that I was pulling away and making things difficult. David's cousin mentioned that Margaret had expressed concern about my attitude problem and wondered if military life had made me too rigid for civilian relationships. I found these secondhand reports oddly liberating. Margaret was finally being honest about her feelings, even if she lacked the courage to express them directly to me. Her complaints confirmed what I'd suspected all along. She'd never wanted me to succeed in winning her over. She'd wanted me to exhaust myself trying. Without me serving as a buffer, other dynamics in the family became more apparent. Margaret's critical nature, previously focused primarily on me, began affecting her relationships with others. David's sister mentioned that their mother had become increasingly difficult to please, finding fault with everything from the sister's parenting choices to her husband's career. Friends who had once nodded along with Margaret's subtle criticisms began to distance themselves. At a family gathering I did attend, David's grandfather's 90th birthday, an event I couldn't skip without causing real harm, I watched Margaret struggle to command the room the way she once had. Captain Whitfield seemed more relaxed without the underlying tension that my presence had previously created. He spent most of the evening telling stories about his Navy service to anyone who would listen, his voice carrying the natural authority that came from genuine accomplishment rather than inherited status. I found myself actually enjoying the event, participating in conversations without constantly monitoring Margaret's reactions or calculating whether my comments would meet her approval. When she made one of her characteristic cutting remarks, this time directed at David's sister, I simply turned away and started a different conversation with someone else. The freedom was intoxicating. I'd forgotten what it felt like to attend social gatherings without armor, to speak without editing every word for potential offense, to exist in a room without performing acceptability. My career began flourishing in ways I hadn't expected. Without the emotional drain of constantly managing family politics, I had energy to invest in professional development. I volunteered for challenging assignments, took on mentorship responsibilities, and found myself being considered for positions I'd previously thought were beyond my reach. The young officers I supervised began seeking my advice, not just about military matters, but about maintaining their integrity in difficult circumstances. I realized I'd become an example of something I'd nearly forgotten, the importance of not compromising your core values for temporary peace. One evening, while reviewing performance evaluations for my team, I understood something that should have been obvious months earlier. I'd been modeling the wrong behavior for the people who looked to me for leadership. By accepting disrespect in my personal life, I'd been demonstrating that dignity was negotiable, that professional accomplishments could be dismissed by anyone with enough social privilege. The realization was both humbling and energizing. I'd spent years teaching young sailors about honor, courage, and commitment, but I'd been failing to live those values consistently. Margaret's insults had been a test, and I'd been failing it not when I stood up to her, but when I'd accepted her abuse in silence. David and I had several difficult conversations during this period. He understood intellectually that his mother's behavior had been inappropriate, but he struggled with the implications for our relationship. His family had always been the center of his social world, and my withdrawal created complications he hadn't anticipated. "She's never going to change," he said one evening, as we discussed whether to attend his cousin's wedding. "I know," I replied. "And I'm not asking her to. I'm just done pretending that her behavior is acceptable." The conversation hung between us, heavy with unspoken questions about whether two people from such different worlds could build a sustainable future together. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was approaching those questions from a position of strength rather than desperation. The effects of my withdrawal rippled through the family system in ways I hadn't anticipated. Without my presence as a focal point for her criticism, Margaret's behavior became more obviously problematic to people who had previously overlooked it. David's sister called me one afternoon, something she'd never done before. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "I should have said something when Mother was treating you that way." I was so used to her being critical that I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. Her confession revealed something I'd suspected, but never confirmed. Margaret's pattern of finding fault wasn't unique to me. She'd been systematically undermining people for years, but I'd been the most convenient target because I was an outsider trying to earn acceptance. She did the same thing to my first husband, David's sister continued. Constant little digs about his background, his job, his family. I thought it was because she was protective of me, but now I see it was just her way of maintaining control. The conversation was enlightening, but not particularly comforting. I'd absorbed months of psychological warfare not because I was uniquely unsuited to the family, but because I'd been the newest person in Margaret's orbit, the freshest target for her need to establish dominance. At family events I still attended, I watched the dynamics with new clarity. Margaret's friends, the ones who had seemed so unified in their subtle disapproval of me, were actually a carefully managed audience. She used them to amplify her criticisms, but she was equally quick to turn on them when it served her purposes. During a dinner party at David's aunt's house, I observed Margaret systematically dismiss another woman's travel plans, critique someone's choice in wine, and make cutting remarks about a neighbor's recent divorce. The behavior that had felt personally directed at me was actually her standard operating procedure. Captain Whitfield seemed to notice my new perspective. During a lull in conversation, he approached me on the terrace where I was getting some air. "You're handling this well," he said quietly, looking out at the garden rather than directly at me. "Handling what, sir?" "The situation with Margaret." I know it hasn't been easy. It was the first time he'd directly acknowledged his wife's behavior, and I wasn't sure how to respond. "I'm learning to manage my expectations," I said finally. He nodded slowly. "Sometimes that's the best you can do. Some battles aren't worth fighting, and some people aren't worth trying to change." The conversation was brief, but it felt significant. Captain Whitfield's quiet acknowledgement carried more weight than any dramatic confrontation could have. He understood what I'd been dealing with, even if he couldn't or wouldn't address it directly. My career continued to accelerate during this period of personal clarity. I was selected for a prestigious assignment with the Pacific Fleet, a position that would advance my prospects for flag rank but require a 3-year commitment based in San Diego. The opportunity represented everything I'd worked toward, but it also forced decisions about my relationship with David and his family. The assignment would mean missing birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings for extended periods. Under my old pattern of accommodation, I might have declined or negotiated for something less demanding. But I'd rediscovered my professional ambitions along with my self-respect. David supported the decision, though I could see him calculating what it meant for our future. Long-distance relationships were difficult under the best circumstances, and ours carried the additional weight of family complications that showed no signs of resolving. Margaret's reaction to news of my new assignment was revealing. Instead of expressing congratulations or even polite acknowledgement of the honor, she made a comment about how military careers demanded sacrifices from everyone around them and wondered aloud whether I'd ever be ready to put family first. The remark, delivered at what should have been a celebration dinner, crystallized everything I'd come to understand about Margaret's worldview. In her mind, my career achievements weren't accomplishments to be respected, but obstacles to the family structure she wanted to maintain. I didn't respond to her comment directly, but I made a mental note of it. Margaret wasn't just dismissive of military service in general. She was threatened by any success that didn't fit into her narrow definition of appropriate feminine ambition. That evening, David walked me to my car after the dinner had ended with typical Whitfield politeness, surface pleasantness masking underlying tensions that no one wanted to address directly. "I know she was out of line tonight," he said, leaning against my car door. "I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished." "I know you are," I replied, and I meant it. David had never been the problem. His support had been consistent even when his understanding was limited. But support wasn't enough to bridge the gap between his family's expectations and my reality. "This new assignment," he continued, "it's what you want, isn't it? Not just professionally, but personally. You want the distance." The question was fair and deserved an honest answer. "I want the opportunity," I said. "The distance is just a side effect." But we both knew that wasn't entirely true. The physical distance from Margaret's sphere of influence was part of the assignment's appeal, though I wouldn't have admitted it 6 months earlier when I was still trying to make peace with her criticism. The conversation marked another shift in our relationship, an acknowledgement that my priorities had fundamentally changed. I was no longer willing to structure my career around family politics or sacrifice professional advancement for social harmony. As I drove back to base that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: excitement about the future. The Pacific Fleet assignment would be demanding, but it represented a return to the career trajectory I'd been following before I got sidetracked by the impossible task of winning Margaret Whitfield's approval. For the first time since meeting David's family, I was planning my life based on my own goals rather than their expectations. The feeling was both liberating and slightly terrifying, like stepping off solid ground and discovering I could actually fly. The months leading up to my transfer to San Diego were marked by a gradual but unmistakable transformation in how I moved through the world. Without the constant background stress of managing Margaret's disapproval, I found energy I'd forgotten I possessed. I threw myself into mentoring junior officers with an intensity that surprised my colleagues. Lieutenant Lisa Martinez, a young woman struggling with imposter syndrome in a male-dominated field, became a particular focus. She reminded me of myself before I'd learned to doubt my own worth, and I was determined to help her avoid the mistakes I'd made. "You don't need anyone's permission to take up space," I told her during one of our regular coffee meetings. "Your qualifications speak for themselves. Stop waiting for validation from people who were never going to give it anyway." The advice was as much for me as for her. I was finally beginning to live by the principles I'd been teaching, and the alignment between my professional values and personal behavior felt like coming home after a long deployment. My relationship with David evolved during this period, becoming more honest, but also more complicated. We both recognized that my withdrawal from his family's social circle had changed the fundamental dynamic of our partnership. "I never realized how much energy you were putting into winning them over," he admitted during one of his visits to my base. "You seemed so composed about everything." "Military training," I replied. "We're taught not to show weakness, even when we're struggling." But the truth was more complex than that. I'd been performing strength while my confidence eroded from within, maintaining a professional facade while accepting personal treatment that violated every leadership principle I'd ever learned. The clarity was painful but necessary. I'd been so focused on being acceptable to his family that I'd lost sight of what I actually found acceptable in return. Margaret's behavior had been a constant test of my boundaries, and I'd failed the test by having no boundaries at all. My new assignment required extensive preparation, including advanced training programs that kept me busy and focused on the future rather than dwelling on past mistakes. The work was challenging and engaging, reminding me why I'd chosen military service in the first place. During a break between training sessions, I received an unexpected phone call from Captain Whitfield. He'd never contacted me directly before, and hearing his voice on my personal phone was startling. "Commander Sanders," he said, his formal tone carrying unusual warmth. "I wanted to speak with you before you transfer to San Diego." We met at a coffee shop near the base, neutral territory that felt appropriate for whatever conversation he had in mind. He looked older than I remembered, his Navy bearings still evident but softened by civilian clothes and retirement. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble once we'd settled at a corner table. "I should have spoken up sooner about Margaret's behavior. I should have made it clear that her treatment of you was unacceptable." The confession was unexpected and more moving than I'd anticipated. "You didn't have anything to apologize for, sir. You were always respectful." "Respectful but passive," he corrected. "There's a difference between maintaining peace and enabling abuse. I chose the easy path, and you paid the price for my cowardice." His words hung between us, honest and painful in a way that conversations in his family rarely achieved. I realized this might be the closest thing to justice I'd ever receive regarding the months of accumulated insults and dismissals. "Margaret has always been." He paused, choosing his words carefully, challenging. "But her behavior toward you crossed lines that should never have been crossed. Your service record speaks for itself, and anyone who knows anything about military leadership can see what kind of officer you are." The acknowledgement meant more than he probably realized. For months, I'd wondered if my perception of Margaret's treatment was accurate or if I was being oversensitive. Captain Whitfield's confirmation that her behavior had been inappropriate validated my decision to stop accepting it. I wanted to tell you something else, he continued, his voice taking on a different quality. About your promotion to commander and your new assignment. What you've accomplished is remarkable, and I want you to know that some of us recognize it, even if we haven't always said so clearly enough. The conversation lasted another hour, covering topics we'd never discussed during family gatherings, my deployment experiences, his own struggles with balancing military and family life, and the challenges facing the Navy in an increasingly complex world. As we prepared to leave, Captain Whitfield extended his hand in a firm military handshake. "You're going to do exceptional work in San Diego," he said. "The Pacific Fleet is lucky to have you." Walking back to my car, I felt something shift inside me. The validation from someone whose military opinion I respected helped repair damage I hadn't fully realized Margaret's treatment had caused. My professional confidence, which had never completely disappeared but had certainly been shaken, felt restored to its proper foundation. That evening, I called David to tell him about the conversation with his father. He listened quietly, and I could hear him processing the implications. "I'm glad he said something," David said finally. "I've been worried that all of this has changed how you see yourself professionally." It did, for a while, I admit it. But I'm getting back to who I was before I started trying to be who your mother wanted me to be. The honesty was another step toward rebuilding my sense of self on solid ground. I'd spent months compromising my values and second-guessing my worth, but that phase was ending. The woman who had earned her rank through dedication and competence was reasserting herself, and she wasn't interested in anyone's approval except her own. My final weeks before the transfer were marked by a sense of anticipation that felt familiar and welcome. I was returning to the career trajectory I'd been following before family politics became a distraction, and the future looked clear and challenging in all the right ways. Margaret never apologized or acknowledged her behavior, but I'd stopped expecting her to. Some people aren't capable of the self-reflection required for genuine change, and that was her limitation to bear, not mine to fix. 2 months into my Pacific Fleet assignment, I received an unexpected email from the Office of Naval Public Affairs. They were organizing a joint military-civilian recognition ceremony in San Diego, honoring veterans and active-duty personnel who had made notable contributions to international operations. My name was on the list of honorees. It was a formal event, full dress uniform required, attended by senior military leaders, local government officials, and invited guests. Each honoree was allowed to bring 2 guests, and I immediately thought of my parents. They booked flights without hesitation, excited to see the Navy side of my world up close. The day of the ceremony, the air was brisk but clear, sunlight glinting off the harbor beyond the event pavilion. Rows of flags framed the stage, and a Navy band played quietly as guests took their seats. I stood in formation with the other honorees, medals in place, the familiar weight of my combination cap balanced just right. As I scanned the crowd, my eyes landed on a figure I didn't expect, Captain James Whitfield. He was seated near the front, next to my parents, his posture straight and his gaze fixed on the stage. It took me a moment to register that David was nowhere in sight. During the break before the ceremony began, I walked over to greet my parents. Captain Whitfield stood as I approached. "Commander Sanders," he said, his voice carrying enough weight that nearby attendees turned their heads. "It's good to see you again." "I wasn't expecting you here, sir," I said. He glanced at my parents. "When I heard you were being honored today, I contacted Public Affairs to see if I could attend. It seemed important." The band shifted into a formal march, signaling we needed to take our places. My parents beamed with pride, snapping a quick picture before I returned to formation. When my name was called later in the program, I stepped forward to receive the award. The admiral presenting it spoke about my leadership during multinational exercises, my ability to coordinate complex operations, and my contributions to strengthening alliances in the Pacific. As I accepted the plaque and shook his hand, a ripple went through the audience. Captain Whitfield had risen from his seat. His stance was precise, heels together, shoulders squared, and in a voice that cut cleanly through the ambient noise, he said, "Admiral, it's an honor to salute this officer." He executed the salute with textbook perfection, holding it until I returned it. The crowd quieted, as though recognizing they were witnessing something more personal than protocol. I could feel the weight of every eye in the room, but my focus stayed on him, this man who had seen me clearly from the start, even when his wife refused to. When the applause came, it was loud and sustained. Not polite clapping, but something warmer, fuller. I stepped down from the stage with the same professional composure I'd carried through dozens of ceremonies, but inside, there was a stillness I hadn't felt in years. Afterward, in the mingling crowd, Captain Whitfield approached me. "That was overdue," he said simply. "Thank you," I replied, the words carrying more gratitude than I could fully express. "We didn't speak of Margaret. We didn't need to." The gesture had said everything. It had affirmed what I had come to understand. My worth was not dependent on the approval of those unwilling to see it. That night, I sat alone in my apartment overlooking the harbor, the plaque resting on the table beside me. The lights from the ships reflected off the water, steady and sure. For the first time, I realized I wasn't carrying the weight of that family's disapproval anymore. It was theirs to hold, and I had no reason to reach for it again. The next morning, I received a short email from Captain Whitfield. "You've earned every bit of what you've achieved. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." I closed my laptop, straightened my uniform for the day, and walked out the door with the certainty that I had reclaimed more than my career. I had reclaimed myself. So there you have it. Sometimes the people who matter most aren't the ones you're desperately trying to impress, but the ones who already see your worth. Captain Whitfield's salute in that moment said more than 2 years of Margaret's criticism ever could. Here's what I want to know. Have you ever had someone dismiss your achievements because they didn't fit their narrow definition of success? And more importantly, when did you finally stop trying to prove yourself to people who were never going to respect you anyway? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your stories might just help someone else who's going through the same thing. If this resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and the bell icon. I share more real stories about standing up for yourself, setting boundaries, and discovering your own worth. Because at the end of the day, the only approval that really matters is your own. What story should I tell next? Let me know what you want to hear about, and I'll see you in the next one.